Hello, everyone, and welcome. Pull out your chair, take a seat down, and welcome to the Forbidden Dinner Table. I am one of your hosts, Zach Martin.
And I am Alex.
And we have a wonderful conversation in store for you. We are going to be wading into the waters a little bit of religion today. So, I think we want to...
holy waters?
That's right. We're going to baptize ourselves in the waters of religion today. We are going to do our best to be honest, be open, be respectful, and talk about this from a little bit of a more wide lens. At least that's my goal coming into this. Not put anything on attack, and just sort of explore the space, right? As one
always
of our themes.
Explore the space, and not just one religion too. So we're going to cover many.
Yes. But before we get into that, I want to do a quick callback from last episode. It was my turn in the hot seat in the last episode. You asked me 3 questions, Alex. Just kind of get to know you, fun questions to go to sort of different headspaces is how I think about it, because it was fun places to go to. Yeah. But I didn't answer one of the questions, and it's been sitting with me for the week where I was like, I don't want to duck any questions, and I've been trying to figure out in my mind, like, what is a really good case to answer this question. And just as a quick repeat, the question you asked me was kind of, which do I dislike more, the far left or the far right? Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Great. And I've been thinking a little bit more, and what is sort of like a really good rational approach to this. And the answer I've landed on is that I dislike the far right more because they are quicker to entice violence.
Oh.
And why I think that? I think there are groups on the far left that also entice violence. Like if you think of the true Antifa, like not the media sort of claim of Antifa, but like the true Antifa who show up in black and like destroy things.
Yeah, that's where my mind immediately went. So I'm glad you said that.
But I think on the right, you've got sort of a ton of different groups that have sort of the Proud Boys and like these different pockets. Or I think about like the death threats to go to Fauci. I think about the whole kind of case there was to kidnap and kill the Michigan governor. I think about just like there seems to be a larger, maybe it's even just more public population on the far right that is quicker to go to violence. I'm not sure too if it's because they're sort of a gun rights advocate group. Maybe it just seems to kind of violence gets associated a little bit more there. But I think that is why it's the like, you can have your ideas, you can shout them at people, but when things get sort of into like an aggressive unrest space, that's when I'm like, whoa, this is way too much. And I think both sides do it, but I think the right can be a little bit more violent. You're shaking your head a little bit.
Well, the interesting thing here is that this is coming from somebody that lives in a city that was being burned down by the left a couple years ago.
Well, was that the left or was that opportunists?
That's true, I guess. The messaging was coming from the left. So this is where I think things get muddy, though, too.
I think the left was excusing it a little bit more than I probably would have liked to see.
That's true. But you also have, like, Kenosha and stuff. See, here's the problem. I think, from my perspective, for those particular examples, the left started it and the right did, like, amped it up further. And so it's kind of hard with a lot of these things about who you ultimately blame, because it's both sides clashing and it's kind of equally both sides' fault by the time it's all said and done.
I absolutely don't disagree with that. And I think both have to hold a responsibility. I just think it seems like the far or aggressive right is so much faster to shout and take it to a place of violence than the sort of far left. And don't get me wrong, there are groups on the far left that will take it to a violent place, and I think it's deplorable. But it just seems like a larger population on the far right, or a larger... It's almost like if you look at sort of like a thermometer, when I look on the left, there's only like 1 or 2 degrees that will take it violent. When I look on the right, there's like 4 degrees that will take it violent.
Well, and I think the other part too is the right maybe does more organized violence. Like you mentioned the Michigan governor stuff, whereas the left is like quick in and out, smash and grab, that type of stuff. So maybe it just looks a little bit different. Because I always think, I'm just walking down the street, I would be more afraid of like a far left provocateur than a far right. However, in some sort of grand scheme or conspiracy theory type thing, way more afraid of the far right. If that makes
I don't know
sense.
if I agree with your, like, if it's an individual person, if it's far left or it's far right, because I would be worried that the far right person would have a way higher chance of being armed.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
And I guess when I sort of look at, and I don't know what we think of as like disorganization of the far left, like the first thing I went to is like those smash and grab robberies in like Chicago, but I don't bucket that as a far left.
Yeah, it's tough to
organized
separate
thing.
if there's some sort of political message versus
Yeah.
just opportunists, like you've been saying. Now, I think you actually made the best point here, which is the left seems to excuse opportunists,
Yes.
but that doesn't necessarily make them the violent ones. Maybe some would argue that it does, but it's a little cloudier.
Yeah, when I think of sort of violence that was more organized, less than excused by the far left, I think of like a true Antifa, which I don't know how we're back to the media problem of like, I don't know how often true Antifa shows up because it's just thrown around like candy. So I don't actually know when it's a legitimate case of it.
Anybody out there wearing black is Antifa all of a sudden.
Right.
Yeah.
I think of the Chaz Chop. Like that is like true, like,
I haven't thought
what
about
the
that
heck are
little
we doing
country in a
here?
while.
Yeah, that country. Haven't thought about those borders. Are we keeping those secure? I think about that as like the far left weirdly like being accepting of violence. Even then, they're not like
Chaos.
accepting it, but they're like creating a ground for, see, even then it's a different relationship because they're creating a ground for it, and it's not like they want it there, but it's like you set up all the dominoes to make this happen.
Yeah, you're breeding chaos, but you're not necessarily
pushing it forward, where the right like weirdly seems to, I don't know if you've ever seen some of the like people who walk up to microphones at like open questions at far right events where they're like, when do we get to like get our guns? Like they'll say that as an open question to the, and the moderators are like the far right people who are on the mics are usually like, well hang on. Like they know like this is going to go out of control if I don't answer this question sensitively. But it's like, how did we even get to where people think they can walk up to an open mic and ask that question?
That's true. Yeah.
So
I think
that's what I've been thinking about a little bit. Maybe I'm not completely like 100% sold on it, but where I've sort of netted out on is the far right concerns me that their relationship with violence is a little bit more broader and even keeled than the far left.
I certainly agree as like an organized thing. Whether or not what's just happening on a daily basis on the street, maybe could be different, but anyways,
I think we should all take a page from McConaughey's book and be aggressively centrist.
yes, for sure. Seek first to understand, and then you can. I don't know. I was gonna say move to fighting, but we don't want to do that. So.
Well, hopefully, if we understand each other, then we don't need to. We don't need to fight.
Yeah, then that gets thrown out.
Yeah,
we won't end up there.
All right. Let's wrap up politics right there and move to a much safer topic: religion.
Green light.
Okay, let's. I want to start this one off with a little bit of a conversation or sort of a common thought. I don't even want to call it a thought experiment. It's almost like a game theory piece in religion called Pascal's wager.
Do you want to define that quickly?
Yeah. Let me set the stage. So this comes from Blaise Pascal, and I'm going to talk through just the kind of what it roughly is Pascal's wager in the simplistic way. So I'm going to do it, and Al, please ask any questions or jump in as the sort of listener to be like, define this or break this down a little bit.
Sure.
More.
It's
okay.
My understanding is it's pretty simple, but I'll let you go, and then we'll see.
So Pascal says that there's essentially two options, right? Either God exists or God does not exist. And he says that you bet your life or your soul in how you live your life by living as if he exists or he does not exist. So if you think of sort of like those pundit squares from biology or that kind of four-way square, you have a decision to make, living your life as if he exists or he does not, and either God does exist or he does not. And that means you have four outcomes. You go to heaven, or you're living sort of a good life and God exists. So you go to heaven, awesome, it's an infinite win. Or you don't live your life, he exists, and you go to hell, which sucks, right? That's like a infinite loss.
Yep.
Or you have that you live sort of a good what I'm just going to put in quotes, sort of Christian life, and he doesn't exist, and then you die and it's all over. Or you don't live a Christian life and he doesn't exist. But I think Pascal would make the argument there that like you sort of missed out on an opportunity to live by good Christian values and have a life there. That's sort of Pascal's wager, and he is. I will say it's a cool idea overall that we're trying to introduce sort of like math or game theory into the religious space. So props up for that and sort of thinking creatively at the time. So far.
Well, let me ask a question. Does he push the reader to live as though God exists because you sort of have nothing to lose by doing that? Or is that just people interpreting it later on?
I believe that's a sort of a push of his. It's sort of like the claim of like, what do you have to lose here? Right? It's I think he's arguing that it's sort of beneficial to always live your life as if he exists and live a life in a Christian life. Because if God is real, then you'll go into heaven. And if he isn't real, you'll have lived a better life by living by Christian values.
Right. Yep. And every time I hear Pascal's wager, it's that piece of it too, is that you might as well live as though he exists because it's sort of better in the long run, whether it turns out he does or doesn't.
Right.
Exactly. Okay. Continue.
So I want to sort of respond to that in two different ways. One, with sort of my own critique of it. And then number two, I think there's been some really good critiques of it sort of right after in Pascal's time, where Voltaire is one person who wrote about it, I think in a really smart way.
I have a response as well.
Okay, cool. Let's do our responses and then sort of talk about the historical response to it. Okay. So my response is, one, I've already said it a little bit. I think it's cool that you're trying to introduce a really new way of thinking into sort of like what I'll just call the God problem, right? And like this is an extremely complex problem that you literally spend your whole life, at least I spend a lot of my time like thinking about what makes a good life and sort of these influences to it. But my problem with it at the heart is it's sort of like an outcomes argument, not a really good argument to believe. It's like, here are the outcomes if you believe, but by no way have you convinced me of a belief in God. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I think I understand that you're saying it's very outcome driven and that you don't even care about what you're doing to get there or what's being asked of you. You're solely focused on the end game.
Right. It's almost like Pascal, I think, sort of steps over a little bit. Like, in order to have what I'll just call discipline to live a Christian life.
That's a good word to use.
You need to, maybe need is the wrong word, but like you have to sort of have this belief that will drive you to make the good decisions, and sort of like when you're running the mentor calculus against decisions, sort of like, well, what would God want to do, in this understanding sort of in like of what it means to be Christian and like sort of how to be Christian. Because otherwise you're literally throwing all of kind of what it means to struggle with any problems or to be human and just react like a robot to be like, well, I'm just going to do the thing that the Bible says. And I don't think that's how humans approach sort of problems or how they interact with life. And so, okay, great. You've given me this argument of like, if you come to believe, or like, then this will be sort of your outcomes. Great. But just telling me the outcomes doesn't help me at all believe that there is a God, right? Like if somebody else comes with good arguments, not on the outcomes, but on the belief part, it's like they are having a conversation in a different space about this topic that Pascal's wager doesn't even touch.
I think that makes sense. You keep bringing up Christianity, and I don't know if it's because of comfort, or is that something that Pascal specifically says?
Well, no. So Pascal was a Christian. He technically was Jansenism, which is like a form of Catholicism at the time, which then the Catholic Church came out and claimed as heresy to be into Jansenism. So that actually, too, if I just skip a little bit to a point that Voltaire makes, is like, Pascal was making this argument for an explicit version of God that he had in his mind. So you almost have to, Voltaire's sort of argument is you have to break the game out into a ton of different versions of like, well, there's the wager for the Jansenism God, there's the wager for the Catholic God, there's the wager for the Jewish God, the wager for Vishnu, right? And he's like, you're betting in one specific game on this idea of a God that you have, but there's hundreds of thousands of games that you can play.
Okay, so now you've gotten into my problem with it, actually, is that if you're truly making this wager, you need to play this game with every religion. you need to worship and go through your life supporting all of the gods. Because if you were to pick one, to me that doesn't make sense. If you're strictly playing this wager game, why would you just pick one? You should pick all of them, in theory.
Well, and so like the problem with that is like the fact that some
some are at odds with each other.
Well, yeah. Well, and I'm trying to think of sort of a simplistic example here of just even like eating pork, right? Like one will tell you it's fine to eat pork. The other one will be like, don't do this. And so it's like, well, now I'm a little bit at odds of how to move forward.
Which it's almost a game you can't possibly play, which then again to me makes this whole thing fall apart. Is if I'm truly wagering, I'd want to put some money down on multiple hands, if you will.
Alex, you had a pretty busy weekend. Yeah, I got the Muslim temple on Friday, I got Jewish temple on Saturday, I got church on Sunday.
But yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is that's almost the best way to do it. If you're truly only taking it for the wager aspect of it, you should do that rather than just pick one.
Right. And now we're so outcome driven that we've missed the point of like
correct. Yeah.
What it means to be human and the belief itself. This reminds me a little bit too, I can't remember the author at the time, but the way that he closed an interview one time where the interviewer just asked him of like, what's your parting wisdom or what's your parting life advice? And the author said, stick with the golden rule. It's consistent across all religions. And the golden rule is do unto others as you would have done unto you. And so I thought about that and I was like, you know that if you want to take something that's sort of like religious or in a way, but transcends across all of the religions, like that's a fantastic.
I love that.
To have.
Yeah, that's one of those things that even from religion, even if you're not a religious person, what a great rule and something you should certainly listen to.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I'm going to tease a little bit later. We're going to get into some more religious facts and things, but there's a reason later on that this wager doesn't matter at all. And so I'm just going to cue that up for us to touch on.
Cool. Well, let's jump over into some of Voltaire's arguments because I think he does a good job too of kind of writing about Pascal's wager. And just a fun little fact too, I believe it's Voltaire who has what I think is one of the greatest last lines ever, like before you die, sort of like parting words in the world.
Ooh, okay.
Somebody said to Voltaire, I believe it was on his deathbed, like, you know, like, do you want to renounce Satan, like, you know, as you go sort of to the grave? And Voltaire said, now's not the time to be making enemies.
That's good. I like that.
So I think Voltaire is just a very unique, interesting sort of writer, very cheeky. I've read one of his pieces called Candide, which is very, very briefly just the story of somebody who is like taught to be an optimist and then has the craziest life where things just keep going wrong and wrong and wrong. And I'm talking like monumental, where he's like working at a castle and the castle gets ransacked. And so then he has to like flee onto a boat and then the boat goes into a shipwreck and like just stacking crazy things. And it's meant to be super over the top. And he just like still is this sort of optimist at the end and just gets pummeled through life. And it's a really good social commentary sort of at the time. Voltaire was mocking some belief systems at the time. So Voltaire's just a super cheeky, I think very sort of intelligent writer and thinker. And some of the pieces he talks about sort of with Pascal is that there's a critique we touched on a little bit, but the contention that Pascal's sort of trying to promote something of a very specific God, right? Of this, like, you're supporting this Jansenism God, and there's so many more different sort of hands that you can play, as we sort of talked about.
Yep.
So that's one thing. I think one piece that Voltaire makes that's really good is the idea that he rejects the idea that the wager is a proof for God, and he says the interest I have to believe a thing is no proof that such a thing exists. However, he does sort of comment that it's an impossible wager to avoid for any living person. Like, you have to sort of grapple with this question. He argued that abstaining from making a wager is not an option, and that reason is incapable of divining the truth. Thus, a decision of whether to believe in the existence of God must be made, considering the consequences of each possibility.
Well, right. And it has to be one of the four outcomes that you highlighted earlier. Yeah, it has to be. There are no other options.
Right. So I think it's really cool that
there might be some gray area, but
totally. But Voltaire sort of says, like, it's not basically, I think of it as by choosing not to interact with this question, you've made a choice. Like you
That's
have
true.
to. You have to sort of.
And what I mean by
neglect this for
gray
life.
area, though, too, is that you and I have talked about, well, I'll live a good life and try to be the best person that I can be, and I'll get into any heaven that's worth getting into.
Absolutely.
So I'm not even necessarily answering the question, but maybe I am a little bit, but just not specifically.
The way I think about it is a reasonable God will judge me on the fact that I did my best and tried to bring good into this world that I saw sort of like that I understood and saw fit. And if that is not the case, then personally, I think we're dealing a little bit with an unreasonable God.
Yeah, we're sort of choosing the yes, God exists, but leaving it open-ended as to which religion has it correct, or
Right.
if any of them do, actually. We're kind of not answering that secondary part of it while still ending up in that outcome.
This is a little bit of an outlandish claim of mine, but I think it seems very odd to me that if one religion has it like completely nailed, right? Like when those religious people die and they like go to heaven and they're like, yep, like you, like it
Just
it
as I
doesn't-
thought, yeah.
It doesn't seem feasible to me. It seems so lackluster to think that when you die and you go up there and you're greeted and you're like, yep, your church was correct. Like the human condition to me has got to be so much greater that when you die, and maybe they would argue just like, well, we have a general idea, but like God's greatness can't be understood. And then when you get up there, you understand it more. But even that, like, I feel like there's got to be some level of surprise when you get like when you die of like, oh, this is what it was about, or like this is what the human condition was about, or what it means to be human. Like, I don't sort of buy the idea. I'm going to pick on, let's just say Protestants for a second. Like, I don't believe that when somebody in North Korea dies and they go up there and they're having a conversation with God, they'll be like, well, I had it all spelled out in this book that just wasn't in your country.
Right. They never had
That seems
access
so-
to the truth. Well,
Correct.
and I agree with you, though. There has to be more that we can't even comprehend. Even if you do, I mean, even if you are very religious, I'm sure there's things that you still would have trouble
Be surprised.
fully understanding now until you die. And then it's like you unlock a whole level of whatever it is, consciousness or your soul or something like that now you can experience, but right now we just can't. So I would still say there's more. Even if you are very religious, you don't fully understand.
Right. Maybe a religion can get you generally closer, or they can be right about something like the fact that there's even experience after you die, right? Like they could be right about that. But to me, there's just it just has to be so much wider and so much greater, and that people for millions and millions of years have to have, I think, this sort of profound piece of it that is not just going to be boiled down to like, well, there's this one church that has all the answers.
Yeah, an interesting thought that popped into my brain right now. If you spend your life focusing on the extra almost, like trying to understand what is sort of not understandable, you could end up learning or trying to become one with more of the death experience than even religions have, because it could be endless how much more is out there. So that was just kind of a thought that I had.
Unpack that more, because I'm not sure. I get
All
a
right,
little
so
bit
let's
what
say
you're
that
saying, but-
religion tells us, what happens after we die, and we understand it, but that's only 20% of what really happens. But let's say you are not religious, and you spend your life trying to, whether it's through meditation or like taking drugs or some other way, try to unlock more of what happens after you die. Let's say you get to 40%. You now know more than the super religious people, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, I would say too, if you take religious customs and views from all the different religions,
Oh, yeah, good point.
that would put you a whole, potentially, I should say, just over 20%, because if like one of them is 20%, you
Yeah.
sort of pull them all together and have different viewpoints of like, especially I want to learn more about like what the Hindus think about sort of an afterlife. And I
Yeah.
just learned, here's just a fun little story I was reading on the internet this week. So there's a ritual that you do on the anniversary of like your parents' death. So, let's just, I'm going to for sake of easiness, I'm going to say January 15th, right? Like we'll say somebody's father passed away on January 15th. So then January 15th every year you do this ritual sort of honoring them. And there was a story of somebody who got the date sort of wrong. They just had it mixed up in their mind, and they started to do the ritual on January 14th instead of January 15th.
Okay.
And their wife that morning had a dream about their husband's father, the guy who's going to do the ritual, and it was like a dream of him running, saying, "Wait, wait, wait, I'm coming."
Oh.
And then the wife explained the dream to him, and he's like, "I don't understand what's going on." He does the ritual and then realizes he's like a day off.
That's really interesting.
And so
it's like the dead father had a ticket to the 15th to go see them, and then was like, "Oh, you moved it up on me. I gotta go."
I'm coming. Like, wait, hold on. Like, that's you're wrong. I'm like, and so when I sort of hear all these like near-death experiences and people sort of sometimes talking about like seeing Christ and things like that, I'm also like, what do you do about that though? Like this thing that's totally non-Christian, that it has this very unique relationship with the afterlife.
That's so interesting. Yeah. It further complicates everything, but it makes it very interesting to hear those types of things across all religions. And maybe there is a bit of like, whatever you do, it's right. Or, there's different ways to interact, or different paths you can take after you die, depending. I mean, who knows? Right. Any number of those things could be reality. Totally.
We'll have to do a whole nother separate episode on reincarnation, because I'm reading a lot about that. I've got a list of things to check.
So actually, in our next segment, unless you have anything else to add, I think we should move on.
One more thing on Pascal's wager, and then we'll switch over. So this is actually probably one of my favorite pieces. It's not Voltaire that wrote about this. It's an individual named Sorio. I'm probably pronouncing that entirely wrong. But they write a very good point that says, in order to accept Pascal's wager, the bettor needs to be certain that God seriously intends to honor the bet. He says that the wager assumes that God even accepts the bet, which is not proved at all in the wager itself. Pascal's bettor here is like a fool who sees a leaf floating on the river's water, quivering at some point, and for a few seconds between two sides of a stone. And the bettor says, "I bet $1 million with the Rothschild that it will take finally the left path." And effectively, the leaf passes on the left, but unfortunately, no Rothschild has ever said, "I will take that bet." Right? Rothschild is just being a stand-in for whoever has a lot of money. I could have said Kardashian to modernize it. But like, you're sort of throwing this bet out into the wind, having no idea if the other side even intends to honor the bet.
You're holding your hand out, and it's not necessarily a given that someone is shaking it.
Totally. And
yeah, that's true. You could live your whole life as if God exists, die, get to heaven, and then even that particular God is like, "You're not getting in here."
Right. Or I think we almost fall, how we talked about this a little bit, of like, we don't live exactly, we try to live by the core of Christian values of treating people well, but it's not like you and I are going to church every Sunday, so we're not living it to a T. But we may get up there and God may just be like, "Come on in," like
right. That's true. Yeah,
it's this piece. And I think there was I was actually just having a conversation with somebody about, they were talking about this book that was influential to them, so I put it on my reading list. It's a book from 1988, so it's a pretty old one, called "Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved." And there's a really good just right up here I'm going to read where it says here, Father von Balasar responds in a clear and concise way, grounding his reflections clearly in Scripture. "Revelation gives us neither the assurance that all will be saved, nor the certitude that any are condemned, and that we should hope that all men be saved, rooted in a love of Christ that reaches into the depths of even hell." So I think this is a really cool idea, and if there is a God, I guess my thoughts are that I fall into this camp of like, dare we hope that all men be saved, that everybody is going into heaven.
Right, yeah. It's too many people, though, want like a judgment day type of a scenario, but those two don't necessarily jive together.
I think that's just a desire from humanity, that judgment is a desire from humanity, that we want good to be rewarded and evil to be punished. That the thief here on earth, some fatherly like figure is overlooking and saying, "You'll get yours eventually."
But there also could be a way that they are punished and then saved, or something. Like, it doesn't have to end there, potentially.
Welcome to purgatory.
Well, yeah, maybe. Or maybe you can be reformed from hell and saved in that way and pulled up. Who knows?
Potentially.
All right. Good.
Yeah,
I like that segment. That was cool.
Cool. Well, let's pivot over to some other and open it wider to even, we've been talking beyond Christianity, but I know that some of these religious facts we're going to go into really kind of run the gamut of religions, which is great.
Yeah, so we have a short article here that's 18 little-known facts about religion, and I got excited when you brought up reincarnation, because fact number 1 is that many early Christians believed in reincarnation. So that seems a little bit interesting and kind of goes against their teachings now. But I think you're right. I think we should maybe do a whole episode on reincarnation. I know it's something that you're kind of getting into, but could you give maybe just a high level of why this has piqued your interest recently?
I have been doing a lot of reading about near-death experiences, shared near-death experiences, and just reading about reincarnation in general. Why it piqued my interest is somebody sort of just asked me, do you believe in souls? And if no, has there been any scientific research done around souls? And that led me to sort of dive into just what exists out there that would be tangible evidence to souls in an existence post-death.
And there has been, correct? There has been scientific research into reincarnation.
Tons, correct? For years, yeah. Like I think the University of Virginia on the East Coast has like a whole department on reincarnation.
That's so interesting. A couple of the things that it says under this headline here is the idea that someone went to heaven or hell based on something they did in one lifetime was doctrine developed by the Roman Catholic Church, most likely to establish more control. After all, if people got more than one chance to get to heaven, the laws of the church would then be rendered meaningless because sinners would get infinite chances to try again, which is kind of what we were just talking about with ultimately being saved, maybe through different opportunities as well.
Ooh, a quick little story here. Yeah. Sam Harris in his latest book, Waking Up, writes about sort of experiments that they've done on the brain. I think this was back in the 70s. And so they would have individuals, patients who had like extreme epileptic seizures. And so in order to try to cure this or address the seizures, they would cut this cord or sort of like stem at the bottom of the brain, which would effectively like put your brain into two hemispheres and not have the ability to talk across to each other.
Oh.
And so they ran experiments with these people who had split hemisphere, and they would do things like have somebody, they would ask a question like, what did you want to be when you grow up? And they would have them with their sort of left hand, which would be connected to the right hemisphere, I believe, write out what they wanted to be, and with their right hand, connected to the left hemisphere, point to what they wanted to be, and they would write out like draftsman, but point to race car driver. So it was almost like their hemispheres had different like consciousness or like own independent
personalities
thoughts
or something.
Yeah, personalities. That's a good way to put it. And the thought is like when they're connected with this kind of cord that was split in these sort of these medical experiments, it's comes together as sort of one, and you're dominated by your language side, which sort of is like pushing forward to like bring thoughts and to words, and your language sort of drives like that sort of dominates your personality. But if severed, you could have these totally sort of different beliefs on the other side of your brain that's like quiet the whole time. And Sam Harris's point is, what do you do if you have a half atheist, half Christian show up to the gates?
That is interesting.
Of heaven?
Yeah. Well, I've told you too. There's times where I kind of think about who I am versus like who I wish I was or who I want to be. That's coming from the inside, from my brain, and sort of those two trying to work together to put forth the person that I actually am.
Yeah. Matt Dillahunty has another example too, kind of on this, where if there's somebody who has this day where like they're an atheist their whole life, but they wake up one day and then it all clicks that day and then they become like a Christian, and on the way while they're walking to church, they get hit by a bus and they lose their memory of that day, and then they continue to be an atheist. Like, does that person deserve to go to hell?
That goes into a different pile, different category.
Right. I mean,
exceptions.
All of these weird relationships to like the idea of a belief driving your outcome a little bit, if that makes sense. Yeah. But so fun to explore. Yeah, totally.
Do you want to hit us with number 2 here?
Yeah, let's do number 2. The Buddha was probably not a vegetarian. So many Buddhists are vegetarian because of the first Buddhist precept, I undertake the training rule to abstain from taking life. But it was said, that the Buddha would not eat meat from any animal killed specifically for him, but apparently didn't have a problem eating meat bought from the marketplace that was already dead.
It feels like a loophole almost that he found in the system, or maybe he was just misquoted or something by saying like, well, I'm not going to kill it, but if it's dead, I'll eat it.
Yeah, someone should explain economics to the Buddha of like, if nobody buys from the marketplace, the slaughterhouses will close.
Yeah, he's big on that Beyond Meat.
Impossible. Take us to the third one, Al.
Number 3. I actually knew this before reading the article, but Jesus Christ is mentioned 5 times in the Quran more than Muhammad. And I did know that. I know Jesus is looked at as a pretty high-level prophet, I believe, in the Quran. He was a spreader of the good word, but my understanding is Islam does a lot to remove sort of the middle layer of management between you and God, and therefore Muhammad and Jesus Christ are sort of just looked at as like other holy people, prophets, but shouldn't necessarily be worshipped or looked up to or something like that.
Yeah,
they're important and sacred in a way, but they're not necessarily worshipped.
It kind of puts Islam and Judaism in the same camp, right? Because the Jews believe Jesus was also like a prophet and a great teacher, but not the Son of God.
Yep.
That's sort of how I view it.
Right. Yep.
So, interesting. Number 4 here. Hindus can also be atheists. I will say Hinduism is definitely sort of a blind spot for me. It's something I'd like to learn more about. But this says, Hinduism is generally viewed as a polytheistic religion with a rich mythology. It is, however, quite possible to be both a Hindu and an atheist. Although Hindu atheists may not have the same belief as other Hindus, they do follow the same moral and ethical code.
I love this because if you go back to one of our early episodes, might have been the very first one, I was talking about things I would potentially strip out of religion and other things that I would keep. And ethical code puts perfect words together into like, there's value in that, but not in necessarily respecting the wants and wishes of a deity. So I kind of like the angle here that they're taking.
Yeah, not to open a can too much here, but I think it's in some of the arguments I've heard or debates sort of that go on between the kind of atheist community and I'll just call it the religious community as a whole. Some points I've heard brought forward by sort of atheist speakers or spokesmen is like, why do you want to spend your life serving? Like, why do you want that? Yeah. Isn't it more freeing to believe that there isn't a God? And like, why do you feel this need to have to succumb and worship something? And I think it's interesting sort of to then be able to take that part out, but still want the good element, like the elements
morals
that bring you good. Good in your life. Right?
I love
to just
that.
Be like, I don't need to be a servant to a deity, but I want these pieces of the religion. I mean, part of it could be just highly cultural too. I mean, there's so much ritualistic and cultural elements in religion. So
yeah, I've related it to what you just described, like growing up and still wanting to have a parent, almost in a way, versus going out on your own and doing stuff for yourself. The parent being God. But I love that you could say, no, I'm going to do my own thing. But if you could hand me like an ethical code or some guidelines, I could still find a lot of value in that. And so you're still kind of in the religion. But I really like that. I like that point. Number 5, Judaism evolved from a polytheistic religion. According to Mark Smith in the Early History of God, the Jewish god Yahweh was one out of 4 main gods worshipped by early Jewish people. The other 3 gods were El, Asherah, and Baal. It was only later that Yahweh became the one and only God for the Jewish religions. Now, this is something that you and I have talked about as well, off mic, about how there were probably even more religions or more sects of current religions, and through conquering and villages dying out and things like that, and all these things are shifting and moving, we get end up with the ones that we have today. But how interesting would it be if one of the early ones had it 100% correct, they died out or got conquered, and then that got replaced with one of these that is maybe not correct?
Well, yeah, when I think about this, when I think of sort of the early tribal days and kind of warring there of if you have a tribe in Judaism that likes Yahweh more, like Yahweh's sort of their main god, and they're beating all of the other tribes, it would be totally fair for somebody on the sideline to be like, whoa, they keep winning. Their god must be more looking over them and protecting them. the Yahweh must be the one true, or the bigger God out of the four there.
Oh, that's interesting too. So even
That's how I think about it.
even not through necessarily like taking people over, but you could watch from the sidelines and say, well, they keep winning, so their God must be right.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think sort of like when Christianity at the time, right, was paired with the Holy Roman Empire and was just dominating. The Holy Roman Empire was just dominating and annexing cities and growing as an empire. They could sort of make this argument, I think, at the time, right? The travelers or the market, the people, how news spread, right? I'm guessing news spread a lot through trade at that time, was like, oh yeah, they're growing, like another city was taken, like we must have some divine peace on our side in order for us to keep conquering as we are. And so then people are like, oh, okay, I want to hear this story of what God is protecting these people and allowing them to have a kick-ass navy.
I've also heard that through the years, yeah, it was like looked at as whoever had the right religion or prayed harder or had some sort of divine intervention, that army or navy won a war. So
right.
Before fighting, the most important thing was to have God on your side. And then they kind of realized that actually the most important thing is to have numbers and weapons and things like that, because then that tribe or whatever usually won the war. And then nowadays we've taken it a step further and gone into like technology and internet and all that kind of stuff. So we're slowly advancing even what we think it takes to win a war, which is interesting.
Well, there's funny because there's an Old Testament story about this where somebody shows up with a ton of soldiers and then God speaks to this kind of military leader and says, send a bunch of the soldiers home because I want you to win this battle with a smaller amount of people so that they know God was on your side.
Oh,
so he like tells a bunch of people to go home and then goes into this battle with 300 people and wins the battle.
How great would that be? You're lined up for war and they're like, yeah, you can actually sit this one out. God called and said you can go home. Like, all right, sweet.
What's crazy to me is like if there truly is this divine God, why the heck would he not just pop over to the other tribe and be like whoever they were warring with and being like, yo, by the way, like I'm real. We don't need to have all this bloodshed.
That's true. Yeah.
That's point. What I think of is like, why is God like propping up warfare?
He could just show himself or intervene and say, hey, I want that other tribe to win. So if you guys just like take a knee.
Yeah.
We'll just move on, be on our way. Like
let me burn some bushes, send some visions, and we'll all be one like tribe now.
Yeah. Good point.
I don't know. Moving on. Number 6, meditation is not limited to Eastern religions. This I think is something. Maybe I'm thinking of mindfulness as a whole, but this seems to be sort of having its a little bit of a great glorified moment in the West, as mindfulness and meditation really is being picked up by a lot of people. And as somebody who follows Sam Harris a lot, he has a meditation app called Waking Up that I like and I use. He makes a great point, though, about how meditation is not an executive stress ball that you can just like do and that will solve a bunch of your problems and you'll become better. Like meditation there's so much more to it that you have to like learn and experience.
It's an exercise. For sure. Yeah. It's interesting here that it says that there's particular techniques to Christian meditation, Jewish meditation, Muslim meditation. So that sounds like maybe something that has fallen off or maybe it has morphed into something else. But it's kind of interesting to see that all of these religions were thinking about it or practicing some form of it. So that kind of goes to show you the importance there.
Yeah. And it says that each of these religions, the Islamic, Jewish, and Christian, have various meditation techniques which bear a striking resemblance to meditation techniques practiced in Buddhism and Hinduism as well.
Number 7, new religious texts continue to be discovered. So I was aware of this as well. I've heard some podcasts on these. The example here that it gives is an example that warrants study is the Gospel of Judas, a recently discovered biblical text that portrays Judas, commonly seen as the Bible's villain, as the one apostle who fully understood Jesus' teachings and turned Jesus over to be crucified because Jesus asked him to. So I think the interesting message here is that there are other texts out there. We've talked about one, too, that involves Peter, like flying around or something like that.
The Acts of Peter.
Yeah, okay. And so my question here, and I'd love to speak to a religious person, is why are they not just all in, or what's with the picking and choosing? That's the piece that I don't understand.
I don't know what a religious person would say to this, but I know a little bit of the historical argument around this.
Hit me.
So at the time, right, you're in year 35 to 300 when the Bible's sort of being assembled. Or I shouldn't even say the Bible's being assembled, but a bunch of stuff is being written about these stories, and then it's being collected. And you want to, as a writer, or just as a layman citizen, you want to get in on the action. So you want to listen to people, write the story, start writing this down. And if you heard people's thoughts and wrote them down and then signed it Alex at the bottom, no one's going to really care or want it.
Okay.
But if you signed it Peter at the bottom,
right,
people are going to be like, wait, this is from the guy that all these other stories about, like his handwritten stuff. And that's why there's like a ton of different gospels written by Peter, because it was a bunch of people trying to make their writing seem important, or like kind of, when I think about it, cash in on this opportunity to write a book, say it's by Peter, and then sell it a bunch.
So there's a lot of fraud then that was going on. And so even when we find these books, it's not necessarily divine word, if you will. It needs to be sort of vetted.
Yes. And I believe that's where like the whole vetting process of, at least I know a little bit about how the Catholic Church, right, like went through a bunch of different texts in their earliest versions of the Bible to finally assemble the books that would create.
But if they can find new ones and vet them, I see no reason why they shouldn't be included.
Yeah, I mean, if they can vet them, I don't know what their vetting process specifically is to say this is legit or not. When I think about new religious texts being discovered, I think of the Dead Sea Scrolls as the first example.
That was the biggest one, yep.
Pops into my mind, which, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd be happy to eat my words if I'm wrong on this, the whole Jehovah's Witness religion is basically based off the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Really?
Is my understanding, yeah.
I should look into that. I think TimeSuck recently did an episode on them, and I have not listened to it yet, so maybe I'll queue that one up for next week.
Come and let me know if I was on the mark or off the mark.
I will let you know.
Cool. Number 8, the Buddha was canonized as a Christian saint. So a Buddhist text from the 4th century was eventually translated and retranslated until the story of the Buddha's enlightenment was retold in the context of a prince named Josaphat, who renounced the world and converted to Christianity, and apparently the story was so compelling that Josaphat became a Christian saint.
Wait, hold on. So the story was retold, but with a different name, and Christians loved it?
So there's the story of Buddha, and it was translated, retranslated, some of the characters sort of changed, and then it sounds like sort of taken and put in through a Christian lens of like somebody who's going through the steps of the Buddha and at the end converting to Christianity, and then people were like, this is an amazing story, this dude's got to be a saint. Let's make this guy a saint.
Actually.
Well, so this reminds me a little bit about Our Lady of Guadalupe, the like very famous story in I believe it's Mexico, where Diego, like in the 1500s, like it's presented this Mary sort of vision, and then goes and collects the cloaks full of flowers, and then goes to one of the bishops and drops it, and there's like the symbol, right, of Mary in whatever cloak he was holding. And when the Roman Catholic Church was on the path to beautifying, canonizing, turning that Diego into a saint, there were individuals at the actual shrine that had the cloth of Mary writing to the Vatican saying, hey, like, just so you know, we don't know the historical accuracy of that person actually existing. There's a thought that it may have all just been a story made up to try to convert the natives and the locals. Because after that, there was a huge push for Christianity, and a huge bunch of the locals, the local natives converting Christianity off of this idea, like this major thing happened. And the people at the shrine writing, these like monks that took care of that cloak, were writing to say, like, we don't want the church to look really, this is sort of a little bit of my read too, I'm adding my own piece in, we don't want the church to look silly. Like, if you turn this dude into a saint and then it turns out that he never existed and was all sort of a quote-unquote propaganda tool to get people to convert to Christianity. So
that's very interesting.
That's the tie-in a little bit this of like, it, at the times where the Buddhist stories translated, retranslated, and put into sort of propaganda tools potentially to convert people into Christianity.
So there are saints in the Catholic Church that might not even be real. Although that sounds kind of silly and funny, but actually when you're dealing with this, like 500,000-year-old stuff, like that shouldn't really be a surprise.
Right. Oh yeah, totally. And you've got
but
translations, retranslations.
Some sort of divine intervention could come in and be like, hey, that one wasn't real. Cut that out.
Right.
just to
but
sharpen it up.
It's super. When I think about sort of just the logic here too, sort of like the mental, I'll call it bias of like, let's say you tell this story about Mary showing up sort of in Mexico and it being converted, and then a ton of people convert. I can see the allure to be like, well, this must be true because a bunch of people converted. And so like, you know what I mean?
That is the intervention.
You can fall into this mental trap, I think, almost of like, like you make a story, a bunch of people convert, and then you use the conversions as proof that the story must be true. And it becomes this problematic.
Well, so then in the olden times, that was the divine intervention. They got their answer in a way based on what you're saying.
It could be a claim.
Yeah. All right, number 9. Islam had the first theory of evolution in the 9th century. So religion and science shaking hands. I love it. It says, while religion and science have been and continue to be at odds, one notable exception is during the height of the Islamic Empire when scientific ideas advanced significantly, even the idea of evolution, an idea which still remains a difficult one to swallow by some fundamentalist Christians, was first advanced by a devout Muslim and scientist by the name of Al-Jaiz.
Yeah, I mean, this is the golden age of Islam, right? They were like the epicenter of math and
culture and just all kinds of things. Yeah, ideas. So science. It's cool that these types of things were discussed and born maybe out of that meeting of the minds, if you will.
Yeah. Number 10, non-Jews can get into Jewish heaven. One does not have to be Jewish in order to be able to merit going into heaven in the afterlife and merit all blessings of God. There doesn't seem to be many references to the afterlife in the Torah, but there seems to be agreement that the righteous of all nations will enjoy the blessings of an afterlife.
So there, you don't have to take the bet.
Boom.
You don't have to take Pascal's wager. Live a good life, and at least you can make it into Jewish heaven. Reading through this list, this was my favorite one. If anybody ever tells you, are you worried about not getting into heaven if you don't believe in God? Hit him with this, because if you live a good life, you can still get into the Jewish heaven.
Yeah, the wonderful next layer that pops out of that question, or what you just said, though, is what constitutes a good life.
Well, right, but
and thus what it means to be human the ball keeps rolling.
But if it's a little easier to swallow, like not taking Pascal's wager, then that's why I kind of like this.
Yeah, I do think that I'm poking at it for the next layer, but I do think this is great. I think this is a great example to tie in one of our sort of last call-outs of like open-mindedness, that you don't have to live explicitly in this exact religious way. There can be more than one way to get to your end destination.
I love it. Number 11, even with a literal interpretation of the Bible, homosexuality may not be a sin. And this goes into some recent talks and some recent scholars. There's a really, really good TED Talk on this. But most people turn to the Sodom and Gomorrah story as claiming that homosexuality is wrong. I will say, based on listening to those things, it's never explicitly said that homosexuality is what the people did wrong. There's a whole list of things. So it's just kind of thrown in there. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, I think.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Jesus Christ in the New Testament never said anything explicitly about homosexuality as well.
No, it's barely brought up in the whole Bible, is my understanding, but it's mostly referenced in the Sodom and Gomorrah story.
Yeah, to which my sort of question to religious people is, okay, if there's nothing sort of in the New Testament, maybe you could make a loose argument that like Jesus referenced some of the Old Testaments or the Old Covenant with God and that the Old Testament is still valid. I would then point to a lot of things in the Old Testament of like, well, you're eating shellfish, you're wearing cloth that comes from two different materials, you're like working on Sunday. Like why do we have to drill down to this specific homosexual thing as a problem?
Well, and to maybe give a little bit more context too, if people don't know the story, I'll super paraphrase it. But if you could look at a man raping another man and saying what you're doing is wrong, it's the rape part potentially that is what they're talking about. And so they never really explicitly say what it is that's wrong, and therefore it can be interpreted a couple different ways. Did that make sense or further complicate?
It made sense to me that the story in the Bible has it's sort of multivariable, and some people just pick out one variable in the story.
Yeah, they do lots of wrong things, and they get told what they're doing is wrong, but it never explicitly says one more than the other, or it's that one. And some of them are kind of overlooked, even by today's standards, like you were saying. So it does feel a little bit weird that everyone just uses that story to point to homosexuality, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Well, and I would imagine, just to sort of steel man the religious side, and I know the Catholic one a little bit more, of like, they may argue like that is all its own thing, and that the relationship of sexuality and sexual ethics comes from entirely different pieces, right? And like I think they're
sure.
going to be, they would make an argument that it's like, let's not get bogged down in sort of the biblical pieces there. There's all this other evidence, natural law, and other pieces that we can derive why homosexuality is bad, right? Is their argument. So I don't want to make the case that like a religious person would sort of like only have this one piece as to argument for homosexuality. That's the point I'm making.
There's more to it coming from the church and things
Their
as
side.
well. So okay.
Exactly.
Yep.
Number 12, the first Buddhist statues were made in the Greek Hellenistic style. Greco-Indians living in the regions of Gandhara were actually the first to carve images of the Buddha. The top-knot hairstyle common on most Buddhist statues was probably borrowed from similar statues of the Greek god Apollo. Is that cultural appropriation?
Old school cultural appropriation.
Yeah. So you literally had to conquer somebody to steal their culture and make it yours. It's very different back then. There's rules. But yeah, this is cool. I didn't know this. The historical Buddha probably didn't have the hairstyle that sounds like was depicted a lot in the statues.
Yeah, that's interesting. Number 13, the world's oldest university was established by a Muslim woman. The Islamic religion has long been characterized as backward and misogynistic. This characterization is misleading, however, and there are many examples throughout history which have shown the opposite to be true. One of them is the University of, I'm going to try my best here, Al-Karaouni, founded by Fatima al-Fari, daughter of a rich merchant. At the university, subjects like rhetoric and astronomy were taught alongside religious studies. Pretty cool, especially women in Islam. I like to hear more about that because they do get a pretty strong rap for being misogynistic.
Yeah, well, I mean, this just makes me think about the sort of Islamic countries of today versus the Islamic countries of 700, 800, 900s.
Yeah.
And the fact that they were like just a totally different world and at the forefront of science and all of these sort of things at the time.
Yeah, it's right. Exactly. They were so thinking and trying to grow, as with most cultures were at the time, right? Sort of become enlightened and all that kind of stuff. And it feels like the cultures of today are very backward thinking and sort of just want to be ultra conservative and go back to a stripped down way of life and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it almost seems at odds with each other, but
yeah. And if I remember correctly, right, it's sort of, I mean, it's definitely Arabic, the invention of zero, right? And sort of the Muslim, because there's no Roman numeral for zero.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well,
so zero
I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
And Arabic. Those are the numbers we use today are Arabic numbers.
That I did know.
Yeah, and so zero is part of that set where there's no zero in Roman numerals.
There's a joke I read that you can anger the right wing by telling them that nowadays they're teaching Arabic numbers in school, when that's the numbers that we've used for a long time.
I thought for a second there this is the joke that I like with Roman numerals, of like a Roman soldier walks into a bar, holds up two fingers and says, "I'll have 5 martinis."
Hey, that's good too. Yeah.
Number 14, the New Testament has a lot of outtakes. There are many books of the Bible that didn't make it to the New Testament. After Jesus' followers were left on their own, the early Christians wrote many stories regarding the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Many of these stories were quite fanciful. For example, there's a story of young Jesus taming dragons.
Jesus the Dragon Tamer.
Heck yeah. Since early Christian writings often contradicted each other in terms of narrative and philosophy, it was up to the early fathers of the church to decide which books of early Christian writings were to be deemed canonical. Is that what? Canonical? And were reflective
canonical,
of,
yeah.
canonical, and reflective of official church doctrine. So this is a little bit what we were talking about earlier of like, there's a process to say what is or is not true. But I would argue out of the 4 Gospels, a ton of them, there's so many contradictions in them as well of like, you could just ask the question of what day was Jesus crucified on. One of them says the Sabbath. One of them says the days leading up to the Sabbath. You could ask how Judas died. And one of them, his guts exploded. And one of them, he kills himself. Like, there's totally different takes on so many different details in the 4 Gospels.
Today I learned that How to Train Your Dragon was based off of religious text.
It all comes back to this.
Not really. All right, home stretch here. Number 15. Many of our great scientists were deeply religious. So today, with all dramatized conflict between science and religion, it's easy to forget that many of the greatest minds in science were actually devoutly religious. This goes back to what we were talking about too, of just at the time all the great thinkers were religious, so they were pushing the boundaries of both sort of at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, Sam Harris has a great quote where he talks about, like, you know, you could say all of the religious people, it was all Christians that built bridges, right? And he's like, there's literally nobody else to do it. Like at the time, everybody is religious, everybody's Christian. There was nobody who wasn't plucking feathers of a chicken that wasn't Christian. Those were the people that were around to do the job. So that's sort of his argument of like, when people say like, well, it was all Christian people that did this. He's like, there's nobody else in Europe at the time, some certain time.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah. Number 16, wearing a veil is not required in Islam. While the Quran does require women and men to wear modest clothing, nowhere does it specifically state that covering the face with a veil is required.
I actually knew this as well during the Afghanistan sort of retakeover as the U.S. troops were pulling out. There were some reporters talking to the Taliban and their new leadership, asking what the women would need to be wearing. She had just the headscarf on and was saying, like, this is what we need to wear. And they were like, no, it needs to be the full veil over the whole body. I know there are terms for these, but they're escaping me right now. And she was bravely pushing them, being like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah, it says in the Quran that they need to wear that thing. And she was like, I don't think it does. Are you sure that it does? And I was like, wow, you are very brave.
Bold.
to go against the Taliban like that. But yeah, I went and researched after that, and it turns out, that it's not explicitly said that that's what you need to wear. It just needs to be modest. And number 17, angels as we know them today are artist inventions. This I knew as well. Angels, as originally described in the Bible, appear as 4-headed monsters or wheels that sparkled like topaz, or fearsome entities with 6 wings. It was only near the end of the 4th century that artists began to portray angels as the 2-winged bipeds as we know and love them today. So yeah, anytime when it's Christmas time and people are putting angels up around their houses and things, you can just tell them that those are lies.
Well, I knew this one too. Part of it is from in the Bible, when angels appear to people, their first sentence or phrase is usually "Be not afraid" or "Have no fear,"
because they'd be terrified, of what they actually look like.
And
monsters appearing in the sky.
This is bad for me to say, but I've heard like stories of people, because I've been reading a lot of near-death experience recollections of them being like, I just saw an angel in the room, and people in the comments will be like, you saw this like crazy 6-headed figure in the room. That does throw an interesting wrench into a lot of like those near-death experiences or things where they do say that they saw angels and their wings and all that, and it's like, no, you didn't. That's not right. According to the Bible, that's not what they look like. Yeah. Bring us home. Number 18, Islamic fundamentalism is a pretty recent development. As shown by facts number 9 and 13, Islam was far from a backwards religion, but one that promoted the sciences. Not only that, but Islam was actually quite tolerant of other religions as well. Today, however, because of the rise of religious fundamentalism in the Islamic world, we've been led to believe that intolerance has been part of the religion since its inception. It's not until the 1950s that Islamic fundamentalism became a real force. So we've touched on this one a lot. It goes back to the early days of Islamic thinkers and, kind of the tolerance. I mean, have you ever seen pictures of Iran in the 1970s?
Yeah, it looks like the U.S.
Yeah, it does. It's wild. My phrase that I've been saying a lot to a lot of different people, because it fits in so many different places, is that culture is a hell of a drug. And
Yeah,
that it
we'll
can-
unpack that on another episode, I think, because it's so true and there's so much to that phrase. It's kind of sad that now Islam is going, backwards, or this fundamentalism isn't trying to progress in things like it used to, because it would be really cool if they still tried to think and philosophize and try to push the boundaries of things versus just kind of going back and trying to rule as hard as they can on their own people.
Yeah, there is some shining lights, though. Just recently, the UAE came out, and they are switching. Well, one, they're stepping down a ton of their aggressive laws, so it's like easier to get alcohol now in the UAE. It's no longer like a crime to have a child out of wedlock, and they're switching their work schedule from, instead of being Sunday through Thursday based on the Muslim calendar, or like sort of Muslim religious holy days, they are now Monday through Friday to standardize with the Western world. Because I think the UAE is making, the United Arab Emirates is making a huge push to be an epicenter for business in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's cool. And that, who knows, you could land and expand in that way too, right? Of have that mindset start to take over and spread, which would be very interesting.
It's a little bit sad if you think about the way of like it takes the dollar, the mighty dollar, to convince
That's
people.
true.
But that's how it literally has been in the United States as well. So we could unpack how civil rights cases were won by the Congress's ability to regulate commerce is
That's
what
true.
eventually led to being able to push in some strength, some teeth and some strength into the civil rights laws in the United States of America as well. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah. What do you think, Al? What was the overall sort of just takeaway of exploring the religious space?
Always a fun space to explore. I would say, I think I heard that 4 out of 5 dentists agree this was a fun one.
Yeah, I'd say this was a fun one.
I always try to sneak it in differently. Yeah, no, it's cool. It's fun to go through lists like this, which I'll put this article in the show notes in case anybody wants to go in and read. And there are some links that further expand to other things, so maybe we can follow that and go forward on another episode. But yeah.
Yeah, I think this was great. The thing that's sort of popping around in my head right now is sort of like the relationship of tolerance and intolerance in religions, and how there's some really good points in here, like the Judaism one of tolerance of ideas and saying you can get into the Jewish heaven, right, as even if you live sort of just you're a righteous person in your nation, and the idea that there are some other religions that have intolerance pieces, or that you can totally just steal statue making and change it to the style that you like. That's what I learned too.
Yeah, all levels of tolerance, certainly. So. Cool. Any final thoughts? Why don't you wrap it up for us?
You know what? I'm gonna plagiarize the end of the other interview and reinforce the golden rule, and go out there, do unto others as you want to be done unto you, or an even shorter version that I like to live by: do the most good.
Do the most good, or isn't it Google that has do no evil? Their
don't be
tagline for a
evil,
while?
I believe.
Don't
is
be
their
evil.
slogan.
Do the most good. Don't be evil. Thank you for listening.
Take care.